Welcome to the Bend Don't Break podcast. I am Aaron Schweitzer, publisher of The Source, with our enlightened co-hostess, Laurel Bronze. This podcast is powered by The Source Weekly, Bend's locally owned newspaper. Listeners tune into this podcast to find out how our community is dealing or not dealing with the new normal. We are joined today by Michael Scott Stevens. He is founder of the Natural Mind Dharma Center on Century Drive in Bend. He opened the center in 1996, and today it maintains a full weekly schedule of Dharma practices and talks, introductory classes, special workshops, and teaching from visiting lamas. Michael has a degree in comparative religion, has completed graduate work in both theology and clinical psychology. He's a guest lecturer on Buddhism for Bend and Redmond high schools when they teach world religion. I don't think I said that right. He's a guest lecturer on Buddhism for Bend and Redmond high schools. I gotta get that emphasis right. He taught a COCC community learning class on Buddhism for the last 20 years. Today, Michael also works in end of life and hospice care. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So today, Bend seems like a pretty supportive place for people who are interested in Eastern religions, yoga, spirituality. There's so many yoga studios in Bend now. But back when you started in Bend, it was mostly a ski town, few breweries. You opened the first yoga studio here. What was the scene like back then, and what inspired you at that time to bring that to the community?
Well, back in the early 80s, there was only one brewery. It was the Deschutes Brewery. And I'd always been interested in kind of what makes us tick. What makes humans human? What inspires us to love and create good relationships with ourselves and the world. And I was writing papers on theology when I was in the third grade. And by the time I got into high school, I did a film on the individuating process, how we find out who we are, what makes us tick as high school students. And I went on into college with that same idea. But I had a really intense experience with my college years, where I had been placed in an advanced science class, and I was isolating DNA from a desiccated rat's liver by myself in one little laboratory. And as I lifted up this little glass rod and this piece of slime draped down from it, which was the DNA, I looked at that and I thought, what does that really have to do with how we think and feel and whatnot? And then a year later, I had an experience that mirrored that in a completely different way. My roommate, who I loved dearly, there were a bunch of us guys living together in an apartment complex. He ended his life. And I was in the cleaning up process, realized that I was picking up pieces of my roommate, his DNA, and there was this like epiphany. What is it that would lead somebody to this? How do we look into the world? How do we have such, rages in our mind that we cannot deal with that and would lead us to do this? And so that's when I went into comparative religions and also.
And Michael, how old were you at the time?
Well, this was my college.
Okay.
So that would have been 18 to 20, 20s. Yeah, 20s. And I started taking yoga classes too while I was going to college, and got involved in studying religions from all over the world. And this is really a long story to answer that question, but this kind of created the foundation of what my interest areas were. When I ended up moving to Bend for quite a number of reasons, I realized that there actually wasn't much available in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, in terms of like yoga classes and stuff. Now there's a yoga teacher on every corner, but back then,
right.
not so much. Rajneeshis were still, the energy of the Rajneeshis was still around, and so on. But I started a yoga center because I felt that there was a need. And so I taught quite a number of years there. But Bend was so different. It was like, I used to say Bend was at least 5 years behind the rest of the world. I think it's caught up now. But back then, it was kind of, I was concerned that yoga would be a little woo-woo. And actually, it turned out to be, because I tried to teach yoga through the community college, and they had to get the board of directors all together and investigate that what I was teaching wasn't strange and crazy and all of that. But anything.
Well, even to today, you still have these folks that pop up and think that, taking a yoga class is somehow walking down a church, aisle to some other form of religion. And
right.
we still hear that, even though
like sure,
there's a yoga studio on every corner.
Well, it just shows everybody has, a filter through which they look at the world.
Yeah. So it's had to have been a challenge for you during COVID to continue to keep the Dharma Center moving forward. How have you guys adapted to distance learning, distance meditation, things like that?
Well, we're transitioned from Yoga Center now to Buddhist Center. And our center has been around about 25 years. That was transitioned after I started yoga way a long time ago, and our Buddhist Center now has a group of really dedicated people, and so we were trying to find a way of addressing the COVID thing, and I went kicking and screaming into the Zoom thing.
I think we all did in some aspect.
Yeah, but we do our events on Zoom, and actually we've grown a little since then. I think it's because there's a number of Sangha members that have moved away, our spiritual community. Mm-hmm. They moved away, and now we have people from Alaska and Southern California and Colorado and Chicago and everything that comes in. So that, if there's a silver lining, it's made some of what we do accessible to people that wouldn't be able to connect otherwise. So that's what we've basically done. And looking forward to getting back together in person, though. So.
Michael, do you do guided meditations over Zoom for people in Chicago and stuff out of your center?
Well, not really. Vajrayana Buddhism is kind of the odd duck in Buddhist traditions. It's not Zen, and it's so a lot of people think, well, this is Dalai Lama Buddhism, which it is, but not necessarily how we think about it. And so when you get involved in the tradition, you learn certain practices, and so it's more like they're self-guided.
Okay.
So you don't actually lead a person through meditation, but the practices themselves are learned, and then you lead yourself through it. And then, of course, we do those practices together, although it's virtually together now, but we do those practices together, and the bringing together of the voices doing the same practice has a vibration that's really wonderful. And that's one of the things we've lost with the COVID, because there isn't that one-to-one vocal thing. We can't chant together, it just doesn't work very well that way. So, but we still do the practices. People have their practice book, and then follow along as I'm chanting. And so we work it that way.
Tell us a little bit about your training, and why you got into this specific kind of Buddhism.
I have a very Heinz 57 variety, if that can even be used as a term anymore. It's showing my age. A real mixture of backgrounds and influences. But when I met my teachers that were lamas in the Tibetan tradition, what they were expressing seemed to be inscribed on my heart for lifetimes. There was an echo of something I remembered. And so I learned from them directly, went on retreats. And of course, I drew on my kind of like scholastic background of things I'd studied before, integrating that. And for some deeply strange reason, people started asking me to teach, and my teachers encouraged me to teach, and poof, we have a Dharma Center, and people keep showing up. And I keep showing up, and we have a good time.
Michael, Laurel and I were talking before the Zoomer started, and we were wondering about the length of time that people do the practice, meditate. What are some of the like longer deep dives that you've done personally?
Boy.
Because I think there's this like, right now there's this people are getting apps and they're doing mini meditations, and then we jumping into longer retreats that might be overwhelming, and I just didn't know how far someone like yourself might have taken it.
It's kind of a hard question to answer from a Buddhist perspective, because really the way Buddha taught, there isn't any place to go and nothing to get. And that's why spiritual practice is kind of oxymoronic in a sense. But that's the foundation of it. And so there is really no deep to go. There isn't any place to find. But when we have a sincere interest in understanding the nature of our mind and how we really see the world, then we will recognize something that helps us. Actually, the way they say it in the teachings, there's really no such thing as a path or ways in consciousness, but ways show up as your consciousness seeks to make itself understood. And so if you recognize a spiritual path and then start using it, the result is already there. So there's not really any depth. There's obviously a learning curve at the beginning, but in Vajrayana Buddhism, cause and result happen at the same time. So as soon as you engage, whatever depth there is to go into, you go.
I think I followed you. I'm not sure. I can't know my listeners out there how far they got on that one.
That's why I don't even recommend this as a path,
Well, Michael, what do you, so in your, with the people you're involved with, what do you, how do you help them deal with something as large as a pandemic or the crisis that we're going through? I mean, I've seen the stats for people who are seeking spirituality right now, meditation, the numbers off the charts as people look to cope. And I got to imagine they're turning to you for some advice on that.
Well, they came to the wrong place. You can tell my sense of humor here. Well, foundation of Buddhist teachings is the law of impermanence. And that's one of the most difficult things for humans to deal with. When things change, that especially when we're not expecting them. If we haven't done our work in working with our mind and settling the mind, then it's very challenging. And so essentially all the practices are to help people settle the mind. They say in the teachings that if we act with an unsettled mind, we'll have unsettling experiences.
Yeah.
But if we act with a settled mind, all of our experiences will be more settled.
I feel like there's a lot of unsettled minds right now.
Yeah, well, it's not only the pandemic, as they say.
Right.
It's the, kind of the divisiveness and the political circumstances and things that we find ourselves in. But in the Tibetan Buddhist, Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist tradition, this is what is referred to as a degenerating time cycle. That time just goes like this. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, and it goes down. Right now we're in a down cycle where a lot of things that we've built up in the up cycle are breaking down. And so they say that there are certain teachings that are specifically geared to deal with that. And some of the things that we do is just learning how the mind sees change, and how we see change for each of us individually. We have kind of a habitual way that we react to change. And when you work with settling the mind, we begin to settle out those habits. And then change is not like the issue. It's just how do you deal with every moment? Because every moment changes. Yeah. So it's how to be present to whatever moment presents itself with as settled a mind as we're capable. And that seems to be helpful to people. There are a lot of ways to do that. We just express a particular recipe. So.
You also have an offering as someone who assists with hospice and end-of-life care. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how this relates to your spiritual path?
Well, meditation itself is actually dying before we die. That's why meditation is difficult. And what I mean by dying before we die is that all of our habit patterns of our mind are rooted in our ego structure. Our self-grasping, our belief that we exist as a solid, separate self. When Buddha woke up, he recognized no such thing exists. We are not a separate self. We're a vast, unlimited, interconnected self. And so when you meditate deeply, what happens is one experiences a deconstructing of the self, a letting go of grasping, ego grasping, and so on. And so that feels like a kind of death. But in the Buddhist tradition, there is guidance when we have our physical death that is very similar to guidance of meditation. So people who have meditated for a long time find that the dying process is not so difficult. But if you've never kind of died to yourself beforehand, death can be very difficult. And in Vajrayana tradition, they have this book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's actually the Tibetan Book of Liberation upon Hearing. And this is a book to be read to a person who is dying, physically dying, coming to the end stages. But a lot of the instructions are identical to the instructions for living. In other words, you live more completely if you die to the false self, and you die more easily if that has already taken place. But if it has not taken place, there is still a way of helping a person ease through their death. And I was with my father-in-law, my mother, my father. I've been a hospice volunteer. And now I'm asked to teach, kind of a Western version of this support for the active dying process. And I find that it not only does it help the person that you're with, it helps you to be with the person that you're with. And
Mike, I got to imagine there's a little bit of, if you're doing hospice care, then you're doing that care with people who are not Buddhists or of that faith. So there's some translation that has to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things my teachers have suggested to me is to make it, to kind of demystify it. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of what my work is. It doesn't make any difference whether you're Buddhist. As a matter of fact, there are versions of the Tibetan Book of the Dead that are used in hospices across the country, but it's translated to make it a little more accessible to the Western mind. But one of the simple examples is that, when we die, they say that the earth dissolves into water, water into fire, fire into wind, wind into space. And there's something that actually happens to us physically and mentally and emotionally when each of those elements dissolves. Now, simply put, we're made out of those elements,
Sure.
That's what makes us up. And so when working with a person who's not familiar with the Buddhist lingo, for instance, we can talk about, well, we're made of elements, and when the element is dissolving, these are some things that happen. For example, when the earth element dissolves into water, that's when people will like spontaneously begin to kind of tear up, but not emotionally. Mm-hmm. And the fluids in the body start to gather toward the heart center. And so there are physical things that go on during that time, but also mental and emotional things that go on. And so you can read or be present to the person basically according to whatever their tradition or whatever they're wanting at that point in time. Yeah.
Michael, let's take a pivot a little bit and talk about the connection between meditation and brain health. There's so much science exploding on this front right now, and I think it's given a real boost to people's perception of these traditions. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, in terms of meditation and brain health, you have to be crazy to want to meditate. So,
well, obviously, if we're comparing it to dying and stripping ourselves away, but it seems to be offering some solace.
Who would want to do that?
Right.
Well, there's a term called neuroplasticity that is bandied about these days in psychology and neurobiology. And the word plastic actually means adaptable. That's why something that's plastic, you can form it into anything. Okay, so plastic means adaptable. So neuroplasticity means how adaptable is our mind, and what they've discovered is that, and they've been doing experiments with people who are long-term meditators and short-term meditators and so on. One thing that they did in, I think, the University of Wisconsin, they split this group into three: non-meditators, people who had just learned, and long-term meditators. And they did these tests with all of the little electrodes on the brain and all of this sorts of thing. One of the things that they discovered is that short-term meditators had a lot of anticipatory stress when anything ever happened. And then when it happened, they worried about it afterwards. And then people who just learned meditation, like only for a month, their anticipatory stress went way down. And then when the stressor hit, it went up, but then it decayed very quickly. The long-term meditators have no anticipatory stress, not worrying about a thing beforehand,
right,
and no worrying about it afterwards. And so there are measurable effects in the brain and brain development from the act of meditation. So it's nice to see East and West kind of coming together on that.
Yeah.
We're going to take the leap and dive into quantum physics. There's been some, an explosion of interest in this topic, and then also how quantum physics relates to spirituality. So I was wondering if you could provide some examples of what quantum physics is and how it's connected to spiritual concepts.
Wow.
in the most accessible way you can.
I know.
And really dumb down.
You have a nerdy scholar on your hand. You're in trouble, right? So let's just say, simply stated, quantum physics says matter doesn't matter.
I think we can end right there.
There you go. Matter is energy.
Right.
Okay. And that energy is organized into the world we see based on the perceiver. In other words, how we see the world, the world that we see is more about how we see it rather than how it actually is. And so in quantum physics, there's this idea that energy is really funny. It's always shape-shifting, and it expresses itself as either wave or particle. Okay. And what they discovered is that our brain structure experiences it the same way. An example would be, well, like if you were sitting down by a stream and had a really beautiful experience, and somebody, asks you, well, how was your experience? You have a hard time putting words to it because you're experiencing it kind of as the wave. But if you would sit down and write about it, then it would be particle. And so what they're understanding about neuropsychology is that our original mind experiences this intersection of wave and particle. When we're experiencing kind of right brain stuff and spaciousness is like wave, and left brain stuff, it's more like particle. And so that's just one example that Buddha was talking about subatomic particles 2,600 years ago. He actually gave talks on partless atoms and how it is that our mind and the filters in our mind create our reality. And so there's this intersection between, quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and our neurology. So.
Wow. Michael, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier in the podcast, where you're talking about how time is also on that wave that you were just talking about, and that we're in this degenerative time. Have you, in your perception, has that been something that you've seen yourself here in like opening in Bend, like 10, 20 years ago? Would you have said things were on the uptick or were they downtick? How long do you have we been on this degenerative slide? And then maybe just to be uplifting, when this degenerative slide might stop and we could look forward to an uptick.
Well, first of all, the word degenerating sounds terrible. It just means that things are, things grow and then things die. Things arise, things fall, and that's just a movement of things. It's just a natural movement of the world, always. But I'm also a geology nerd, so I've seen these long eons of ups and downs. Mm-hmm. And so if our mind is settled and recognizes impermanence, then we don't even worry about it too much. In terms of timeline, sometimes they say it was after World War II, kind of the degenerating time cycle started. Okay. And you see this in Indian traditions and so on too, East Indian traditions and Native American traditions. They have prophecy cycles that are very similar. And they say this is the particular era where we're doing this. And it's not like a downer. It just means that these things happen. And so, for us living here, it's just a matter of how we adapt. And so in a degenerating time cycle, we need to be more real with how we're treating the planet, how we're treating each other. It's just kind of we need to have concentrated effort now. And then it'll move back again, but who knows? Who knows when?
Yeah, it feels a little like a downer. I just gotta, for someone who's not that enlightened, it feels like things are coming apart a little bit, and it's like that dying process is not that great right now.
Yeah, well, look at the mountains that we love, right?
Yeah,
we ski and hike in them, and they're so beautiful. But how did they get here?
Oh, there was an explosion.
Big, Now, if we were out skiing or hiking and on this mountain and we went like, wow, this is here in this moment, but it'll probably be gone again. So in this moment, I can really, really thoroughly enjoy. I can thoroughly, thoroughly enjoy it. And so dealing with these kind of down cycles has to do with how can we stay where we are and open ourselves to the level of love of which we're capable. And then we don't worry too much about timelines. You know, as a matter of fact, they say in the teachings that degenerating times have the greatest opportunity for us to wake up and to overcome our obstacles to loving each other. And many texts talk about that. So,
well, it does seem, I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on for this podcast is because I was stunned by the kind of data that I've been seeing about people searching for new spiritual outlets, the increase in, you know, I mean, if someone had told me before the pandemic that virtual yoga was going to be a thing, I would have laughed. I was like, well, no one's going to do that kind of thing via Zumba or Zoom, but they're going crazy. So maybe that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think so. You know, whenever we experience change and loss, it makes us reassess our life. And now we're just experiencing kind of on a planetary level. You know, you can't really avoid it.
No.
And so during those times, we have the greatest opportunity to basically get over ourselves.
Sure.
You know, and
Michael, we are unfortunately running out of our time here. Is there anything you'd like to say to viewers, or any parting advice as we conclude the podcast?
I think the only thing I would say is that, you know, the Dalai Lama once defined Buddhism as, if you can help people, help them. If you cannot, at least do no harm. And so most of the traditions express something like that. And so during this time, I think the real importance of really listening to each other, and especially listening to the people that we don't think we agree with. You know, listening to the unknown, getting a little bit more comfortable with that. And then what happens on that deep listening is that our heart opens. We have greater empathy and greater love and compassion for all beings equally. We don't separate out people. We don't have all this divisive language. We are kind of like naturally inclusive. If we weren't so full of ourselves, we would be naturally inclusive, you know. And the Buddhist path, and it's not unique, but the Buddhist path is about kind of getting over our self-absorbed points of view so that we open to everyone, you know, according to our capability. You know, that's not going to happen like immediately, but, you know, according to our capability. And it begins where we are. You know, your family, your coworkers, you know, your Zoom fans and friends, you know, start where you are, and then be open to some kind of thing that supports you, whether it's yoga, meditation, whatever, prayer, contemplative prayer, whatever form. You know.
Right. Well, Michael, thanks for taking the time to be with us. It was a really unique and special podcast. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. You know, and I think you're doing a really good thing. I didn't quite get the Bend Don't Break title at the beginning.
Oh, come on. That's right up your alley.
I know. I think my literal mind was good enough. I absolutely loved it. I think it's like one of the best things. And I tell people, have you seen the Bend Don't Break thing? Or what are you talking about? I said, go to that online. It's wonderful. And so thank you for doing this. It's one of the things that'll help to heal this planet. So
Thank you. We hope so. We've been, Laurel and I have been having a great time. So,
yeah,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
oh, you're welcome.
all righty.